Hey, welcome to Let It Be. I'm Vanessa, and this is my little corner of music YouTube. So I've done a few of these videos already in the past, where I look at the albums that I love from a year that I have done a deep dive for. Sometimes they've made a list for these years in the past, but I've expanded my listening of the albums of each year. So usually that leads to some shuffling and some changes to what I would have originally had as a list. So this year's no exception, quite a few changes from previous lists that I've made for this year, but there are still some mainstays. So getting back to what year we're talking about, it's 1974, a year that often gets overlooked or looked down upon in as far as like the years of the 70s or the years of music history. But I think that it gets underrated a lot. It's a very interesting, very different year. Like there's a lot of big names from the 70s that released albums in years surrounding this that are missing this year. So I think that sort of leads to the appearance or the illusion, I guess, that it's kind of a weaker year. But I think if you look deeper and you check out more things and maybe get outside of your comfort zone or explore, there's lots of stuff for everybody. Like I actually listened to more albums this year than I have in past deep dives. I listened to and rated 218 albums overall over the course of quite a while. And there was a lot of variety, a lot of stuff that maybe I didn't love, but other people do, and from different parts of the world too. So probably a lot of this stuff was not as easy to get at the time, or definitely wasn't as easy to get at the time for most people. So we have the advantage now of having so much more access to things. So we get to see all the things that were maybe hiding within this year. And yeah, I found a lot to love, as I often do. I have 85 4 stars and above albums. So there's a lot of great albums that I won't even get to talk about here on this list because I'm only going to talk about my top 15. So there's another 70 awesome albums that I'm not going to get to mention. So there's things that are probably among your favorites that I might not mention, but more than likely I liked them. So yeah, it's all relative. There's a lot to love about this year and a lot more to love than I think it appears on the surface. I mean, especially if you're looking at the hits of the year, it's a strange top 100 year end. I've looked at it myself and I mean, I'm sure it made more sense at the time, but there's some things there that I don't really get. So yeah, I can see by looking at that, it looks like there's not a lot going on this year, but there's a lot happening outside of that, I think. And a lot of people have expressed, and a lot of people that I know that like different kinds of music have found things to love this year that maybe they weren't expecting to find. So that's one thing I love about this year. And I think it's underrated for sure. And I am always happy to defend it. So here's a few albums that hit my top 25 that I'm not going to talk about too much here in the video today, but I always put a graphic at the end of these videos of my top 25. So these just missed my top 15. We have the Kiss self-titled Kiss debut, great hard rock record, lots of great catchy songs. On a totally different side is Bob Dylan's Planet Waves, his album with the band, really underrated, I think, as well as Court and Spark by Joni Mitchell. Not necessarily a giant Joni Mitchell fan, but that would be my favorite album by her overall. And another that just missed the top 15, but is in the top 25 would be The Hoople by Mott the Hoople. Just fun, glam rock, great time. So those are in the 16 to 25 realm. But going on to the top 15, starting with Burn by Deep Purple. So they had two albums this year, both albums that I really liked. This one makes my top 15, but Stormbringer is not too far behind. It's just outside the top 25. And I also own that one. It's a really good album. So I just really like they sound more reinvigorated here after the album they had in 1973, which was definitely not among their best. They really come back out the gate with a bit of a new sound. They have some new members. They have, of course, they have David Coverdale and Glenn Hughes sharing vocals on the album. And I really like the way that they work together and bring themselves into the songs and work with the members of the band that are still there. It comes out right out the gate with the title track Burn, which is a really hard rocking, great way to start the album in the new era. But there's also some other other songs on here that I really love. Sail Away is one of my favorites, just kind of funky, and just so catchy, always gets stuck in my head, just a really great song. And Mistreated, I love that one as well. It's just sort of a slow burn, but it's just a really good song. So yeah, it's a new era. Seems to be a bit of a divisive era for people, but I think it's a great era, as well as the eras like the Mark II era that everybody loves. I think people maybe leave this one behind, but I think it's due for reassessment from some people maybe, because this is a great album and one of the best of the year for me. So that is Burn. Next to have Big Star and Radio City, which is their second album. Number one record is an album that's very high up for me as far as even my albums of all time. This one, not nearly as high for me, but I still like it a lot. They're missing Chris Bell, which is unfortunate. He brought a flavor to the band that I think was needed. And this is them moving on after he's gone, but I still think there's lots of great stuff here, lots of great songs. Of course, September Girls, which is a song that a lot of people associate with them as, their main song. And it was the first song I actually heard by them, although not by them, but by the Bangles when I was a kid. And that's what got me interested in them in the first place. So it's a good gateway to getting into them. But I think that there's still a lot of really fun power pop type songs on here, and some nice ballads, as they're known for, which was some of the best songs on the first album. So I think that it's still a great album. I love Big Star. I love all their main era albums from the 70s. So, and they're all a little bit different, which is nice. It's that part is cool. Even though I love number one record the most of them all, I still can appreciate all three of the records and the variety that they bring. Radio City is no different. It's a great album, number 14 of the year. 13 is Pretzel Logic by Steely Dan. I have all the Steely Dan albums of the 70s, but in this box set, so I don't have the cover to show. But yeah, Pretzel Logic, it sometimes is in the running for my favorite Steely Dan album, although the first three sort of flip-flop between them. That is my favorite era, I would say, of the band. I just like what they're doing in this time period the best, even though I appreciate everything from the 70s. I just really, there's something about this album that I just really like. And I don't even know if I can always articulate what it is about Pretzel Logic that makes it special. But when I was listening for a long time, it took me a while to really get into the band and really appreciate them. The first album I heard from them was Royal Scam, which is my dad's favorite. And I didn't really gravitate towards it at first. And then I tried Asia, didn't really gravitate towards that. So it was a little like, well, maybe I don't like this band. But then I went through their catalog because the channel Taste Like Music was covering them a few years ago. So I was listening along to a lot of things that they were covering at the time. And I was doing it chronologically, and I was liking the first two albums. And then when Pretzel Logic hit, that was when I was like, okay, I get this band. And then I started to appreciate everything sort of in retrospect and come around to Royal Scam in Asia more, and all the other albums from that period. So it was kind of like the album that unlocked them for me for whatever reason. What it is about it, I don't know exactly, but I just like what they bring to the album. There's a little bit of variety, and I just love all the songs. So yeah, it's in the running a lot of the time for my favorite, and maybe it is. It's really hard to rank their albums because there's a consistent amount of quality in that time period for the most part. So it really just comes down to preference of the sound that they're gravitating towards at that certain time and like the songs. And yeah, Pretzel Logic is definitely up there. Yeah, so that is number 13 of 1974. Next up is an album that's on my shirt and gone down a little bit from my original list for a variety of reasons, but it is still a very important album to me, and that is Red by King Crimson. Growing up, I was pretty adverse to prog music, which I think was sort of the messaging sent at the time. Punk was always really held up by the media that I read and the critics that I read. And it was always sort of framed as this counterpart towards stuff like the indulgence of prog and all of the stuff from the early to mid 70s. And it was like the statement coming out against it, which it was in many ways, but that doesn't make the stuff that came before bad. And that's really the lesson that I had to learn. And this was the album that started that transition for me and started that change in my thinking. So it's a very important album in a lot of ways for my appreciation of prog and stuff like that. So I'm still not necessarily like an expert or an enthusiast totally, but I have a much higher appreciation for the genre, and I found a lot of stuff to love. So it's been enriching to open my mind. But anyway, Red, I think, is just this really cool kind of heavy album. It's got a bit of a unique sound that way, and it's unique to them and just unique to the genre in a lot of ways. And I just love what they bring to the table here. The only thing that sort of holds it back is that one pesky song that everybody talks about, Providence, and I've flip-flopped in my feelings on whether or not that brings the album down or not. It's ultimately not my favorite. So it does sort of detract a little bit, but it is still part of the pieces of the album. It's something I would never listen to outside of the album, but I think it does work to some degree. But everything else is so great that it can't help but stand out a little bit. So that does bring it down just a teensy bit when I compare it to everything else from the year in my feelings, but it's still a great album, and it's still an album that is really very important to me. And yeah, it set me on a road to opening up my mind and appreciating a genre that I had sort of dismissed out of hand without knowing much about, which is never a good thing to do. So number 11 is the only one that I actually don't own in a physical format, and that is Diamond Dogs by David Bowie. And this is an album too that is another one that appreciation for it has grown over the years for me. And I think in general with people, when I originally went through David Bowie's discography, I didn't necessarily appreciate it as much as the albums around it. And I sort of overlooked it, I would say. Still enjoyed it, but it is sandwiched between some massive errors of his career. So it's hard for it to stand out. But as much as it's not necessarily on the same level as Ziggy Stardust, obviously, or even Aladdin Sane, but it's still great, and it's still better than people give it credit for because it's still David Bowie at the height of his powers in a bit of a transitionary time in styles and just his approach to music, because he would do some different stuff after this as well. And you can kind of see the seeds of that happening here. It's like a bit of a bridge. The thing I like about this album is that there is a lot of songs on it that you don't hear very often when you hear David Bowie out and about. Of course, Rebel Rebel is a big song. You hear that a lot, but you don't really hear much of these other songs on here. So, and they're great songs. I mean, 1984, I love the Candidate Sweet Thing trilogy. sort of suite that he creates on here. The title track is great. Rock and Roll With Me is great. So yeah, it's filled with some great songs. That leaves the album feeling like a bit of, don't, all of his albums in this time are a treat to listen to. I don't want to make it sound like it's better than the other ones, but there's something about it that you're almost reminded every time of its greatness because you're not necessarily always thinking about it, because it's not one of the ones that is upheld as one of his best. So it's always like, I don't know, like a hidden gem, I guess, in a discography of someone who is definitely not overlooked in the grand scheme of things, and he gets plenty of praise and love, but he still has these albums in there that maybe do get overlooked. And I think Diamond Dogs to some degree is one of them. So that is why it makes my list and why it's one of my favorites of the year. Next up, on a different note, is New Skin for the Old Ceremony by Leonard Cohen, who is someone who seems to make a lot of my lists on here. Because I love him. This is one of my favorite albums of his. I just think this is one of his best batches of songs, and I like the arrangements on it and what he brings to the table here. And of course, like Chelsea Hotel Number 2 is a classic. That is just like one of his best songs, I think, overall, even. But there's a lot of other ones here. Is This What You Wanted is a great album opener. I really like that. Brings a nice energy to things. And Lover, 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 the Singer Must Die, Who by Fire, Take This Longing. It's full of great songs, great writing. It's not too much else to say about it. It's just a solid album by him in an era where he was putting out a lot of great stuff. He sort of struggled a little bit in the years after this for a while, but I think this is a great statement at the time of what he was doing. And again, one of my favorites by him overall. Number 9 is, they have it set up kind of crooked. Fulfillingness is the first finale by Stevie Wonder. Of course, this is Stevie continuing on in his glory days of the 70s. He's just banging out all these great albums. This one, maybe I don't have as high as some of the others surrounding it, but I still think it's great. It's definitely more of a vibey album and kind of a mood setter, I'd say. But I still think there's plenty of highlights on here. He's at the top of his powers, of course. Creepin' is a great song with great backing vocals from Minnie Riperton. She really just brings something special to that song and elevates it. Heaven is 10 zillion light years away is fantastic. Boogie on Reggae Woman brings a bit of a different flavor to the album, kind of brings up the tone a bit. Too Shy to Say, It Ain't No Use. It's just full of lots of great songs. And again, sort of like Diamond Dogs, it's not the songs that you hear all the time. So it feels like a little bit special in that sense, if that's really the way to express what I mean. It's just kind of like another sort of hidden gem within gems, I guess. It's sometimes overlooked by people because of what surrounds it, but it's still great in its own right. So that is, and the title, I mean, as it's been pointed out by other people, the title does not help. It's so hard to say and hard to remember. So that doesn't help it either. But I still think it's great and it's worth checking out. If you're overlooking it, I think you need to reconsider. So anyway, next on the list is an album that was a big surprise for me in a lot of ways in this dive. Sort of an album I'd been intimidated by before this and had been putting off listening to my own detriment. But that is number 8, and that is The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway by Genesis. Wow, it's just a fantastic album. And I think has really been an album that has become my favorite by the band, although there's still some more I need to explore. But I'd heard everything up to this point, and I really liked a lot of it. But something about this album just really, really elevated them for me. First time I heard it, I was like, oh, this is really cool. There's some great songs on it. But then something just made me want to go back to it. And when I did, that's when it really hit. And that's when it all really elevated in my mind. And I couldn't get enough of it for a while. And even though it's a double album, concept album, pretty intense, I think it's just very listenable. And I think that it's something that I don't know that I was totally expecting, because sometimes when you hear that whole like prog concept double album, it sounds like a lot to take in, and it sounds like an intense experience, and it is, but it's a good intense experience. And this is just filled with so many great songs on their own. Like, and you never hear them anywhere. Like, I had no idea about any of them. Like Carpet Crawlers, the title track, It, Counting Out Time, uh, all great songs. And within the album or outside of the album, they stand alone and they're very listenable, as well as the whole narrative here that comes with the album. I don't know that I totally get the whole story, but you do get an impression from the music from it, even when you're not like closely paying attention to everything. It still comes across to some degree. But the music is so good that it doesn't totally matter entirely either. Like, you can still enjoy it without really focusing on that. And yeah, there are some bits of the album that get a little less immediate, I would say. Like, there's some sort of, I guess people would say, indulgent or scary parts, but I think it all fits in to the whole piece of the album. And I think it works really well. And it's only one that I can see actually growing in my estimation over time, because I just absolutely fell in love with it. And it rose on my list a lot over the course of doing this project. Originally, it was kind of just outside the top 25, but now it's come up to number 8 because I just love it so much. So that's probably one of my biggest surprises, and one of my, and definitely my favorite discovery of all this is The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway, which is not something I would have ever expected growing up, because Genesis, the only thing I really knew about them growing up was their pop stuff from the 80s and in the early 90s. And at that time, wasn't necessarily something that resonated with me. So to go back and hear all this other great stuff that they've done is just been a great experience. So number 7 is someone who has made my lists before and will again. Spoiler alert. And that is Todd by Todd Rundgren, which is another album that I would say is definitely less immediate than some other stuff that he's done. And it is a bit of a difficult album, I think, especially if you are more used to his pop side. There's some of that is here, but there's also a lot of like more experimental stuff going on, and more Todd just being Todd and like doing all kinds of crazy things. But I think it's an album that, if you're a fan of his, it just becomes more and more rewarding over time the more you listen to it. And it's one of those ones that the crazies love, I guess, and maybe the average person isn't as enticed by. But it's one that's definitely grown for me as well, because at first I didn't know what to think of it, especially after hearing Something Anything and It Wasn't a True Star. I wasn't totally sure what to make of this album, but over time it has endeared itself to me and really only grown in my estimation. And yeah, it's a great one, but it's one that might take a little time to appreciate. And next up, we have something that is much more easy to listen to for anyone, and that is Heart Like a Wheel by Linda Ronstadt. So growing up, my mom is a big fan of Linda Ronstadt, and this is her favorite album by her as well. I remember her listening to it a lot when I was growing up, just doing things like painting and stuff around the house. So it definitely has like a personal connection and a nostalgia to it. But I also think that it is her best album overall. I think she's just at her peak here, as far as like as an interpreter and a vocalist. And just this set of songs showcase that better than maybe some of the other projects she's done. Don't get me wrong, I like a lot of her other albums, but nothing as much as I like this album. This album as a full piece is my favorite, just the way everything comes together. It is a lot of covers, so people overlook it for that reason, but I think that she brings herself to the songs in a way that, not that it makes you forget that they're covers, but that she inhabits the songs in a way that makes them her own when she's singing them. And I think she does it the best here. Sometimes on other albums, I don't always love the covers. So this is where she really hits her peak with that. And she sounds great. The band sounds great. And they've selected just a wonderful batch of songs. So yeah, it's got a bit of a personal connection. It's a bit of a comfort album. Like, if it's just an easy one for me to put on a lot of the time, if I just, had a bad day or need to have that sort of album on that just is an easy thing to put on and puts me in a good mood and I love every song, it's this album. So it's got to make my list for that reason. Number 5 is another person who is also on my 73 list, and that is Graham Parsons with Grievous Angel. Just a great posthumous album. Those are pretty rare, I think, and it's helped by the fact that it was the album that he was recording at the time of his death. So it is, I think, closer to his vision than some posthumous albums end up being. Moving on from that, it's still a great album regardless. Of course, the focus is always on the partnership between him and Emmylou Harris, which they are wonderful together, and they show that on their first album together with GP, and they continue it here. But I think also you can't ignore the contribution of the fantastic band that he had playing with him that really enhances the music, the songs that they did together. We had Al Perkins on pedal steel, who is a master anyway. He's one of the best of that era, and he's here, he's shining. And you have, I think, Emory Gordy Jr. does some great bass work, and everybody brings so much to the table to create this atmosphere of the cosmic country, which has gone on to inspire so many people over the years, and for good reason. It's just got this nice blending of this great sound, but like it is informed by the original classic country music, the greats, like the Hank Williams of the world. I think that they inform this music very closely, and you can hear that appreciation, but also it's moving things forward in a way that we see the inspiration in people who are making music now. So it's just a very important and a great album. And they sing the hell out of these songs together, and just always a joy to listen to them. And Emmylou is the harmony queen anyway, but together with the Graham, just a fantastic showcase of that. Number 4 is Late for the Sky by Jackson Browne, which is an album that really blew me away the last time I went through this year on a smaller scale and made a list. This album was one of my new discoveries then that I loved, but has continued to become a favorite of the era. And it's my favorite album by Jackson Browne, too. I think these are some of his best songs that he's written and performed. And it's really, really, really elevated on this album by David Lindley, who worked with him on a lot of his classic era albums, but really shines here and really elevates these already great songs that have great lyrics and great melodies, and Jackson Browne is great on them, but that guitar work from David just really takes it all up a notch and just makes it just an all-timer. Like, just beautiful, beautiful songs that really resonated with me when I first got into it and continue to now. I mean, Fountain of Sorrow, Late for the Sky, farther on, just especially opening the album with those 3 songs is just like grips you right away. So yeah, it's just absolutely great and has risen a little bit on my list over time. And I've now gone through all of his albums and can confidently say that it is absolutely my favorite from him. Number 3 is an album that has risen for me lately. It's an album I've known for a while, but has really hit in the last little while. And that is Eldorado by Electric Light Orchestra. So this album, I think, is just a fantastic example of an album that really all the pieces work together so well and fit together so well as like a complete album that feels like it seamlessly transitions into each song and just works very well from beginning to end. But at the same time, a lot of these songs would be great on their own. So they don't necessarily need the album to work. They work so well together. So it is surprising to me to learn that there was only one hit from this album, which is obviously Can't Get It Out of My Head. And that was the only single released from the album. And that it feels like a lot of these other songs really could have been hits, like Laredo Tornado, Boy Blue, um, Nobody's Child, all great songs. I know that Mr. Kingdom, it does have sound a bit like Across the Universe on the verses, but I think that even with that, it still transitions away from that to become its own song. But that might not have been the best choice for a single, of course, with that sort of in there. So it all lends itself to an experience that I find is exhilarating from beginning to end. It's a very exhilarating album. You really get wrapped up in the sound of it, and you really feel the. I mean, it's very expansive and very big sounding, and you feel that. And if you like that sort of thing, it's. I mean, you can absolutely get wrapped up in it, and it becomes a bit of an addictive album. Like there's points where I was listening to it multiple times a day because I just wanted to hear it so much. So that really had to bring it up on my list and in my estimation for the year as well. So number 2 is another one that I've known for a long time that has risen quite a bit for me, and that is Crime of the Century by Supertramp. And I definitely need maybe a better copy of this. It's a bit beat up, but well loved, I guess, by someone before me and now by me. So it's just another one, kind of like Eldorado. I think as a full album, it works together so well, which is interesting because unlike Eldorado, I feel like so many of these songs I've heard for so many years, like on the radio and just around. I know that they are bigger in Canada than they were in the States, I think, overall, and have lived on more here because I feel like I've heard Supertramp so much growing up with their big songs. And maybe to a point where for a long time I probably took them for granted a bit. But I have come to really appreciate them over the last while, especially. And this album is just such a fantastic piece, again, like Eldorado, as a full album. It all works together so well. It becomes addictive. It's just full of great songs, and the songs function well on their own, but as a piece of work as well. So that is always really the best thing you can ask of an album, because there's so many different ways to enjoy the contents of the album. So yeah, that had to come up on my list as well. I just think that they, of course, don't do, this is definitely their best album, I would say. But they have several other good to great albums in this era. And I think those all as a piece might get overlooked to a certain degree in sort of in comparison to some of the songs that are bigger. There's some great stuff on here that I don't hear as much, especially I would say like Asylum and If Everyone Was Listening are 2 of my favorites on this album that I don't hear very often. So it's always nice to find those little gems, and even in an album filled with great songs that are pretty ubiquitous. So that is number 2 of the year. And number 1 has not changed and probably will never change for me, and that is No Other by Gene Clark. Gene is an artist that I fell in love with at some point in the mid 2000s. I found out about White Light, and I don't know how or why, but I just absolutely loved that album at the time, and it became one of my favorites. But it took me a while to really explore anything else for whatever reason. And my dad, who's a big Birds fan, had this album, No Other, but didn't have any of his other albums. So No Other was the only album he knew. So then we sort of traded off, and that's how I first heard No Other. And it was quite a different experience from White Light. It's a very different album. So, but it's still just as great, if not greater. I don't know. I love them both a lot. So it's hard to say. But there's just something about this album that every song is great. I really can't pick a least favorite album. It gets me every time. Just what he put into this, he put everything into this album. And unfortunately, it was not a success at the time. And I think that that was a very deflating experience for him as an artist, which is really sad. And I'm glad that we appreciate it now. It's just sad that he never got to see the appreciation this album has gotten over, especially the last few years, I would say. I would say it's really, really risen as far as people talking about it and elevating it and giving it the love that it deserves has really, really increased in the last while. And I'm seeing more and more about it in different places. And that's always nice to see. And I'm glad to see him get some accolades that he deserves. And just every song is great. Like, it's so hard to even pick a favorite song. Like, I look at it as like, could it be Strength of Strings today, or from the Silver File, or the title track, Lady of the North? Like, they're all so good. And it's like the really the whole top three here. It's another album where every song is great on its own, but as a piece together, it really elevates everything and brings it to the next level. So can't imagine anything else is my favorite of the year. It's pretty well always been this one. There can be no other. That's my list. What are your favorite albums of 1974? I always like to see them. Just let me know. What do you think of the year as a whole? I know that it's a bit of a divisive year as far as what people think of it. Of course, I am a big defender, as I said at the beginning, but I can see the other side of it too. I mean, it is a bit of an interesting year that way. So yeah, just let me know. And till next time, bye.